Hey folks, Colin here from Something's Recording, and today we're going to be starting a mix breakdown series. Here in the first episode, we're going to be breaking down how to mix rock drums. We're going to be breaking down a rock drum mix here today, but before we dive in, if you are looking to dial in a repeatable workflow for getting professional sounding drum mixes, then I want you to go through my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This workshop is going to walk you through the simple 3-step process that I use on almost every single one of my drum mixes to help you get professional sounding drum mixes every single time out of your home studio. It is a 100% free to watch, on-demand video training, and you can get access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Now let's jump in here and explore this drum mix. Let me start, of course, by playing you the finished mix for this song, and then I will solo up the drums so you can hear just the drum mix for this song. So here is our finished mix for this song.
One step, and it's much too far. Take 2 steps, way too close, but take 3 steps, and I'm into your arms. I'll do all it takes to get to your heart. One step, and it's much too far. Take 2 steps.
So you can hear it's a pretty powerful sounding drum kit. The kick's got a lot of nice bottom end to it. The snare's got some good crack to it. We have a couple overdubs here, or an overdub and an add-in, right? We have a couple cymbal overdubs here just on some of the downbeats to help there. And then the other thing that we have added in is a reverse cymbal just going into some of the bigger sections here for effect. So we're going to start all the way at the kick drum here, and we're going to work our way across to the room mic here. But before we dive in there, let me explain the routing that we have going on here. So we have 2 kicks. We have a kick in and a kick out mic. Both of these guys here, you can see are routing into this fader, which is called the kick level. So it's a little sub bus here, and it gives me complete control over the kick as a whole, so I'm not messing with both faders here and mixing them individually and then trying to balance them, and every time I want to bring the kick up I have to highlight both of them. I have one fader to control the overall kick sound here. Same kind of thing is going on with the snare. We have a snare top mic and we have a snare bottom mic. Both of the snare mics are running into the snare level. That's this fader right here. So it gives me complete control over the snare as a whole. I'm not messing with individual faders. I have one fader to control my snare overall. And then you can see both of these sub faders here, the kick level and the snare level, are running into my drum bus, which is down here at the end. Those are the only two sub faders we're going to have inside of the drum mix here. Moving across, we have our stereo overheads. We have a mono room mic. We have the stereo cymbal overdubs, and then the stereo reverse cymbal, as well as a stereo room emulation. And all 5 of these here, almost said 4, all 5 of these are running into the drum bus as well. Now to start, let's take a look at our kick drum. So I'm going to solo up our kick drum, and you can hear what our finished kick sound is like. Got some nice attack on the top end, but still very, very nice and hefty in the bottom end. We've got 5 plugins here on our kick track. But the first thing we're doing before we even hit the fader here, the group fader, is we're doing our balancing on these 2 here. So I want you to hear the raw kick drum here. This is just a balance between the kick in and the kick out mic. So it's a good sounding kick to start, and that's what you want. A bad sounding kick is going to be a lot of work. It's probably one of the hardest things in the drums to get sounding right next to a bad sounding snare drum to start. But we've got a great kick recording here. The first thing I like to put at the front of my kick chain is just a limiter for a little bit of control before we head into EQ, before we head into compression, anything like that. It gets me a level of evenness before we start processing, which is always nice. You can see our kick drum isn't too crazy sounding, but we have a couple peaks here and there throughout our kick drum. And all this limiter is going to do is help hold those in place a little bit here. So I'm going to hit play. You can see the ceiling is all the way down here, and I'm pushing a dB in on the threshold. The release is not really fast here, right? We've got a 100 millisecond release here, so we're not going really crazy and just getting aggressive on our kick drum. 100 millisecond release, make sure it's kind of moving with our kick drum as it grabs some of these peaks. So take a listen. So mainly what this is doing is you can see we've got one big peak right here where he really lays into the kick drum on one of these downbeats. And that's okay, we want some of that energy, but I don't want it to overshadow completely these smaller hits here and some of these doubles. So all this limiter is doing is grabbing that bigger hit, pulling it down by about 3 dB. So we get a little bit better balance between the larger hits here on some of the downbeats and the quieter hits for some of the doubles and some of the fills here. That's all our limiter is doing here to begin with. Now, once we have that level of balance, then I want to put in my EQ here. So we've only got 3 moves on this first EQ. This is just general EQ before we feed into the compressor here. So I'm going to turn these couple moves off here. We're going to start with just the high pass filter. The high pass filter is always the first move I'm doing on EQ for kick drum, just to clean up that sub area and focus our bottom end more on the fundamental rather than the heavier stuff down below here. So take a listen without the high pass, and then I'll click it in. Focus on how our low end changes. You can hear it actually feels like our low end gets bigger with the high pass in because we focus in on that fundamental by clearing off some of that low sub area that we don't necessarily need in our kick drum here. It makes more headroom for our fundamental area, which is around the 70-80 hertz, to bloom more. So by clearing up that bottom end, we actually make our kick drum bigger. That's our first part here on our kick drum. The next thing was I heard a little bit of ringing. Sometimes you get this from the snare drum. If you have that kick in mic, or the kick out mic can catch some resonance as well. Just the combination of these two mics, there was a little bit of ringing that I think was coming from the snare drum here. So take a listen without it, and then I'll boost it up so you can hear the ringing I'm talking about, and we'll cut it out. You can hear it was ringing sympathetically on the snare hits there, or the snare beats. So we're just finding that frequency, notching it completely out so the Q is all the way up, as narrow as possible, and then we're pulling it down by about 12 dB there, just so it's not coming through in the rest of the mix. Last thing we have here on our first EQ is just a little boost up on the top end here. It didn't need much, but a little bit of energy up here goes a long way sometimes on kick drum, especially if it's a really well-recorded kick drum and you already have some nice attack coming from your kick in mic. Just a little boost up on the top end can go a long way to get you the attack that you need. So we're doing about 3 dB at 9K, so that gives us some air up on the top end, as well as reaches down and brings up some attack for us as well. So listen with and without this boost. Just gives us that little lift, that little bit of air, and it helps to make our kick drum feel like it's going to sit inside the mix, right? So you'll hear this energy on the top end, and that's going to help our kick drum cut through inside the track here, as well as give it some bloom. I like the air that's on some 9K, 10K boost gives on kick drum. That's our first EQ. Next thing we got in place here is our compressor. Now this is pretty much the default settings my compressor opens up at, besides like the threshold and the makeup gain, of course. We've got a 30 millisecond attack and 120 millisecond release. Now the 30 millisecond attack, kind of on the medium slow side here for this compressor, and the reason being is we want to leave room for the initial transient, for the initial attack on the kick drum to come through. Otherwise, if our attack is too fast, we cut off that attack, we cut off that transient, and our kick drum loses some life. Now the release, I usually leave around 100, 120 milliseconds depending on how fast the kick drum is. The release you want to set so it moves in time with your kick drum. So your compressor, your gain reduction should move in time with your kick drum. That's how you get that nice breathing and that nice sense of movement. Now the ratio here, 3-to-1 ratio. Not going too aggressive, not trying to neuter this kick drum here, but not being too gentle. We don't want to be too transparent here as well. The idea with this compressor is we want to tighten up our kick sound and emphasize that attack area. That's why our attack is at 30 milliseconds. We leave room for that initial attack to come through, and then we compress the kick drum. We're going to do about 7 to 10 dB reduction here with our compressor. Take a listen. You can hear the compressor tightens up our kick drum a little bit, so we lose some length, but that's okay. On these doubles, we definitely don't need our kick drum ringing into each other like this. So it tightens our kick drum, but it also emphasizes that attack element. So that initial attack, that initial transient, it gives us some emphasis there to help our kick drum feel more aggressive and to especially help it cut through the mix. So we got that boost feeding into this compressor, stacking some top end energy there, stacking some top end click. So that's our compressor there. The last thing on the output is just about 3 dB of makeup gain to make up for all this compression we're doing here and kind of set the level where we need it on the bus channel here. Last thing we have here is our more surgical style EQ here. You can see we've got our low end going, then we have a little cut here, and then some work up on the top end to kind of set things where we need them inside the mix. So this is an EQ you would put in place further down on the line in the mix to set the kick drum exactly where you need it inside the mix. So we're going to go through these pieces one by one here inside the mix. Probably the most important one is this 2 dB boost at 80 hertz. So this is giving us that bottom end from our fundamentals. So take a listen with and without this here. So that's our weight. That's the weight we need on our kick drum, that bottom end. And you can see the cue's focused a little bit, so we're not bringing up too much of this 100, 150 hertz or too much of the sub area that we already reduced. Now, there was too much low mid area going on. Sometimes you can get that kind of headache frequency around 200, 250. So we're pulling a dB of this out. Take a listen. This is going to be a little bit more subtle, but see if you can hear this. And you can see we're getting a lot of snare energy there at that 200 hertz as well. So it pulls some of that out to help our kick drum feel a little bit cleaner. Next move we have going on here is just pulling back some of this high mid area around the 2-3K area. We're at exactly 2K and we're pulling about 3 dB out, and it's a wider scoop here. The mid range here, the high mid area, can get too slappy sounding sometimes. We boosted some air up on the top end in our last EQ, but we didn't really do anything here in the high mid area. And this can get kind of slappy sounding and give you that basketball feeling. So we're pulling a little bit of this out to help our kick drum feel more natural sounding and not so slappy or crazy sounding in this high mid area. So take a listen to this cut. You can hear it actually helps our kick drum feel bigger because we're removing a set of frequencies that we don't need. So it makes room for this bottom end to shine and that top end air to shine through. Now we have two moves up on the top end here. Both of these are half dB boosts at 4K and at 7K. So this is adding some high mid attack here, and then a little bit more, just a touch, a half dB more of this top end air here. So listen without these, and then I'll kick both of them in. These are very, very subtle moves, but just finishing touches to sit our kick drum in the mix. Just that extra edge, that extra attack on the beater, and that extra level of air up on the top end. Now we have our finished kick drum. So take a listen to our kick drum overall after, and then I'll turn off all the plugins. You can hear where we started. We've got tons more attack up on the top end for our kick drum, and our low end is a lot more focused. That's what we've got. We've got low end weight, but it's focused at our fundamental, and we've got top end air and top end attack, but it's very, very balanced. It's not coming in on those bigger hits and then disappearing. It stays there. It's consistent throughout our kick drum here. Moving down now across to our snare drum here. So we have our snare top and our snare bottom, and you can see we've got our level balance between them here. So take a listen. I'll turn off the reverb as well here so we're not hearing that. This is just our raw snare drum, just getting the balance between our snare top and our snare bottom. So again, a great sounding drum to begin with here. A good sounding snare drum. It's got some bottom end to it. It's got some crack to it. It has some resonance too, which is always nice on a snare drum. It helps you feel like the drum kit is live, right? Because it is. It's a live kit, live drummer, and we want the audience to know that. Same kind of way we worked on our previous drum here on the kick drum, opening with a touch of limiting here just to control some of these bigger peaks here on the snare drum. So take a listen here. We got our ceiling at -10 and same gentler style of release here. So we're not getting really aggressive right to begin with, right off the bat here on our snare drum. So you can see our biggest peak is this guy here. Some of those bigger peaks, they're really, really fast, and a limiter is kind of the best way to grab those and tuck them back into the mix. So just doing 3-4 dB limiting on these bigger peaks here, just to tuck them back in and balance them with the rest of the snare drum. Otherwise, when we get our EQ boost in, our compression in, those can get out of control very, very quickly. Next plugin here, just our EQ. Very, very gentle moves here. You can see we'll get our more surgical moves later on down the line, just like we did with our kick drum. High pass, little cut, little boost. Same kind of way we worked on our kick drum, right? So let me turn these off, and we'll start with just our high pass filter. Up quite a bit higher than our kick drum was, but we want to roll off that bottom end that we don't need on our snare drum, that sub area, not getting sub information from our snare drum, and we want to take care of much of the bleed from our kick drum as much as possible as well. We're rolling a little bit into the fundamental here, but we can always boost low end back later. So take a listen to our snare without and then with our high pass filter. You can hear we thin the snare drum out just a little bit, but we're leaning more towards that top end energy, that crack, and that bottom snare sizzle to begin with. We'll get some of that weight back. Don't worry, that's coming down the line. Again, there was some ringing here on the snare drum, so take a listen to this frequency. I'll boost it up so you can hear the ringing that we're talking about. We're going to reduce that a little bit, not as much as we did with our kick drum. We want to keep some resonance on our snare drum, otherwise it'll feel too dull sounding. So take a listen to this frequency. So you can hear it's still in there. You can still hear it, but overall, inside the entire mix, there won't be ringing that's kind of dragging out on our snare drum, especially when we layer on compression here in a second. That can get overwhelming sometimes. A little boost here in the mid-range, and it's a little broad. We're keeping it at 1 here, so we reach down towards 1K and up towards about 3K here. We're at 1.75, so adding some mid-range, this is going to add some fullness and some crack to our snare drum, albeit subtly here. That half dB actually makes a bigger impact than I was expecting it to. It brings up that energy in the mid-range to help you feel the impact of the stick making contact with the drum there. And that's, of course, what we want to hear from our snare drum. Next in line here is our compressor. So same kind of process we used on our kick drum here. A little bit quicker with our snare drum though. So you can see our attack is up to 25 milliseconds here. Our release is up at 100 milliseconds here. Our snare is quite a bit quicker than a kick drum transient. So we need our attack dialed up just a little bit to catch that transient on the back end there. So it's not too sharp sounding and we're just crushing the back end of our snare drum. So we move our attack up a little bit, leaves room for that initial transient to pop through, but it's not as much room as our kick drum. So we're not just destroying the back end of our snare drum. Now the release is dialed up, so it leaves room for the snare drum to have some resonance on the back end here. Same 3-to-1 ratio, so not too aggressive, but not too gentle here. And we're going to do our reduction here. So you can see how much reduction we're getting on our snare drum. And watch our meter, you can see how it moves with our snare. So we're getting the same kind of effect as we talked about before on our kick drum with the compressor, okay? Because we leave room for that initial transient to pop through, we're emphasizing that attack on our snare drum. So it gives us a bigger impression of the stick making contact with the drum. So our snare feels more powerful and more aggressive. That's my main want from this compressor, is that attack, that emphasis, and it does tighten our drum a little bit as well, which is always helpful. So we're doing about 6 dB of reduction there. That's where we get that tightness on our drum, and that's where we get that main bulk of attack. Now there is a little bit more limiting just to grab those same 2 peaks here, because they can get out of control with boosting and compression as well here. So just a touch more limiting on those. About 2 dB there, 2.5 dB. Nothing too crazy, just tucking those back into the rest of the drum. Here's our more surgical work, half dB and dB moves across the board here. So our first one is just bringing out a little bit of this mid area, this low mid area source snare isn't too muddy or too heavy sounding. You can see it's a dB at 315 here. You can hear how just that dB reduction there in the low mids clears up our snare drum, and you hear more of that top end area, which is what we want to come through on our drum here. Now, same kind of move here, but even subtler, pulling back some of this mid-range area around 700, which can get nosy sounding on the snare drum. So take a listen to this. You can hear those two cuts there are working together to give our snare drum that extra level of clarity. Now these two moves up on the top end, again, we're going to put these in together here. So it's a dB boost at 3.5K and a dB boost at 8K. Now from the 8K boost, this is where we're going to get that air up on the top end. This dB boost at 3.5K is going to give us some extra crack there in the high mid area. So they're going to work together to give us more top end crack and air here on our snare drum. So those two boosts go a long way to give us our stick attack, and they bring up the bottom snare, that little sizzle up on the top end of our snare drum. So that's our snare drum overall. Let me A-B everything here, and I'll throw in the reverb as well so you can hear the reverb on our snare drum. You can hear we lose some body on our snare drum with our processing in, but that's kind of the compromise you have to make. You're never going to hear the snare by itself inside this song. It's running all the way through with a bunch of other instruments, so big guitars, keyboards, vocals. Your snare needs to be able to fit inside the mix, not just inside the drum mix and not just by itself. If it were just a drum mix, we would leave that weight in on the snare drum. And if it was just a snare mix, we would leave all that weight in, right? But to fit it inside the drum mix and then to fit it inside the mix as a whole, we need to pull some of that out. So we hear more of that top end crack, some of that air, but we still have some body to it, just not as much to begin with. Let me show you the reverb here we have on our drums. It's just the standard medium studio reverb from inside PreSonus Studio One Room Reverb. It's like 800 milliseconds to a second long room reverb there, medium style room reverb, and then just an EQ after it, rolling off everything below 200 hertz. That makes sure our snare drum doesn't get too heavy sounding in the room reverb, and then everything piles on to get a muddy snare sound. So that's our kick and our snare. Let's take a listen to both of those together. Great foundation for our drum kit here. Now our overheads, only a couple moves here on our overheads. 3 moves on our overheads. We got a high pass, trimming out our low mid area, and then a little bit of shine up on the top end for our cymbals here. So starting with our high pass. Now the main reason for the high pass here is to clear up the bottom end. For me, I like bottom end to come from mainly one source with instruments like this. So for drums, I just want the bottom end coming from our kick drum. So we're going to clear up some of that space on our overheads here to focus our drum kit, to focus our low end. So we're minimizing the amount of kick drum we have coming in on our overhead sound here, and you can hear it cleans up our drum sound a little bit. Sometimes the lower end coming from your overheads above the kit can be kind of messy sounding and very, very loose sounding. We don't want that to blend in with our kick drum or give us phase problems or anything like that. Next move we have here, this is where we're going to give our overheads some clarity. We're going to pull out all this muddiness here in the mid-range and the low mid area. So we're at 400 hertz. We're going to pull out 5 dB. Really goes a long way to clean up our overhead sound. It's like pulling a blanket off the overheads, right? Our snare and our kick feel very, very muddy and very heavy sounding. And then we put this boost in, and suddenly you realize, oh, there's some shine up on the top end. Our kick drum has some weight, our snare drum has some weight on the bottom end, but it's not really heavy sounding, right? So we're getting rid of all of that low mid energy that's making our overheads feel muddy. Last thing here is a dB.5 boost at about 5.5K here. And this is just to add some top end, some brightness to our cymbals overall. So you can hear it gives us some brightness on our cymbals, and it gives us more emphasis on the stick attack on our hi-hat, which is really nice. That gives you some definition when you pull your overheads up inside the mix there. We're going to skip the room mic for a moment. We're going to talk about these two cymbal mics because they go in context with our overheads. So you can see same boost up on the top end here, just no low mid cut, and we've pulled our high pass up a little bit further on the cymbals. So it's the same mics we used to record the overheads, just did a pass, hitting some of the cymbals to add in or blend in for emphasis on some of the downbeats. So take a listen here. So we've rolled the high pass up right to where the bottom end of the cymbals in. We don't want to cut into the body of the cymbals here. And I've left that same boost we had on our overheads in to add that brightness and that shine to our cymbals up on the top end. Now, the reverse cymbals are the same thing here. So same kind of high pass here going right up to the bottom end of the cymbals, not cutting into the body. The only thing I've done is I've taken off that high boost to give our reverse cymbals an edge of darkness. I don't want them to have so much shine because they can get too crazy swelling up with that top end there. And then a touch of reverb after. So it's that same medium studio reverb. I've just dialed it up to about 50% here on the reverse cymbals. Take a listen to our cymbal swell here. Also gives them some decay on the back end, which is a nice effect, adding some reverb to your reverse cymbals. So those are those two things quickly there before we dive into our two room sounds here. Now on the room mic, we've got a couple things going here, an EQ and then some compression as well. Now the EQ, one thing I do like doing on my mono room mic is rolling off the cymbals up on the top end here. So I've got a couple moves. I'm going to take all these off here. First thing we're going to talk about is the low pass and the high pass filter. Now the high pass I like to roll up right below the fundamental, the kick drum. I actually like to leave some low end in on the room mic because it balances really well with the kick drum. We don't get phase issues because they're further apart and it's ambient sound. And then I pull in the low pass filter to get rid of all the crazy cymbal sounds that can come out from a mono room mic. So I pull this up mainly for weight and body on our kick and snare here, and we'll talk about this big cut in the mid-range as well. So take a listen with and without these two filters on our mono room mic. You can hear without those filters in, that top end is pretty crazy sounding when we hit some of the cymbals. And I don't want to add any of that to the drums. I like it to be pretty clean, coming mainly from the overheads. So with the room mic, with these two filters in, it feels pretty thick, right? And that's mainly what I want to add with the room mic is that level of thickness, but not too much. That's why we're going to do the huge cut here at 400 hertz to pull out muddiness. We want to add thickness and weight. We don't want to add muddiness here. So listen to this 8.5 dB cut at 400 hertz. So this shows you here that when you're adding thickness on drums, it doesn't have to make your drums muddy. We can add weight, we can add thickness while it's clear, right? And this move here this 8.5 dB cut at 400 hertz. That's what's giving us the clarity that we can still bring this up and dial it into our drum kit to get this low end body and the weight without it being too muddy sounding. And the last move here is I wanted some more of this bottom end weight in the room. So I'm adding a half dB at about 80 hertz here. Take a listen to this on the room mic. Just some extra weight down there on the bottom end, and also balances our kick and snare better inside our mono room mic here. Now next, I like using this Fairchild compressor on room mics sometimes. We're not going to do much with this, but just pushing some of the input gain and pulling the threshold back. You can see our time constant is all the way up to let go as fast as possible on the drums. We don't want to crush them too much or hold on too long. And this can give you some length sometimes as well on the room mic. So take a listen without, and then I'm going to kick this Fairchild in. So we're getting a couple things from the Fairchild, from this compressor here, the FC670. We get some attack on our kick and our snare, which is really, really nice. It gives us a lot of low-end attack on our kick drum, which mixes lovely with our original kick mic, our spot mics here on the drums. But we also get some length on the drums overall. It makes the room mic feel bigger. It pushes our drums further back in the room. So listen one more time. Pay attention to that depth change on our drums. So without and then with. So pushing the kit further back in the room to give us that extra level of depth. So we've got all of the original spot mics in. So let me put these in for you so you can hear what just our dry kit sounds like with the reverb on the snare drum. So good sounding kit. The last thing we're missing is some stereo ambience. That's why I have this Bricasti in here. So all this is the open air reverb from inside of Studio One. This is an IR loader, so it allows us to load in reverb IRs here. And I'm using one from a Simplicity pack. It's a Bricasti pack, so it's Room 2, Studio B, and it's the close mics. So we're at 400 milliseconds here, so I've dialed this back to fit inside the drum kit here. And then following that reverb, same kind of thing we did on the snare verb here, rolling off that bottom end to make sure it's not too heavy or too muddy sounding when we roll it in with the drums, and then rolling off some top end so the cymbals aren't too crazy. Same thing we did on the room mic here, right? Last but not least, following this is a width plugin. Sometimes reverb emulations or IRs can be too wide sounding when you load them in, and it doesn't feel natural inside a drum mix. So I've just narrowed it up so it feels like it fits with the kit and it feels more natural and more lively. So take a listen with and without this on our drum mix here. So we'll add this in on our drums. Gives us some massive, massive depth on our drums, helps them feel more live, helps them feel more energetic, and gives them a bigger presence inside the mix here. So here's our overall drum mix. This is our finished drum mix for this song here. Kick, snare, overheads, 2 room mics, cymbals, and then reverse cymbals. Those are the components of getting a slamming rock drum mix here. A little bit of EQ, a little bit of compression on each of these tracks, and then adding our ambience or adding our cymbals, any overdubs we need later inside the mix. So things like adding length on our room mic and then adding in our Bricasti to give our drums that presence and that sense of bigness in the mix. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to take your drum mixes to the next level and really start dialing in a repeatable workflow for cranking out professional sounding drums, then you need to go through my 3-step framework for Mixing Drums Workshop. You can get access to that completely for free by clicking the link below in the video description. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you in the next video.